Hey everyone, thanks for coming back out to Harvest Hills Ranch. I'm Dr. Arland Hill, and today we're going to be taking a look at carnitine and talking about that particular amino acid as it relates to the consumption in red meat. I'm going to dive into some of the benefits, what it's actually used for, and also talk about some of the maybe best stated as controversies as to why you would not consume carnitine, but we're going to dive a little deeper into that and see if those are actually of something that should be of concern to you. If you're new to the channel, haven't had a chance to visit, we talk about all things nutrition. So out at Harvest Hills Ranch, we are running a regenerative agricultural farm. We do everything under regenerative principles, grass-fed, finished beef, pastured poultry, and eggs. And so we use that mindset, and I do that in the context of trying to provide or trying to produce an adequate human diet and providing that to the patients that I work with. So if you are interested in this kind of content, by all means, come back and join us. But today we're going to be diving into carnitine, and what I thought I would use as a starting point for today's conversation is sharing with you a recent example of a report that I received and reviewed for a patient in looking at a carnitine deficiency and just talking a bit about what that particular, why this particular deficiency showed up and what the significance of this is and just how impactful it is. So first thing to make note of on this particular report, you'll see in this amino acids and metabolites section, this gentleman did have a carnitine deficiency. Now, interestingly enough, when I had the conversation with him about his carnitine deficiency, one of the things that he pointed out to me was, hey, look, I'm not as active as I used to be, so maybe I'm not really understanding where all this is coming from. And his thought process on this was that carnitine is found in meats, is where we get it dietarily. I'll speak more to that in just a moment. But he was thinking, hey, look, I'm not out exercising. I'm not running as much, pounding the pavement like I was. So I'm not really sure why I have a carnitine deficiency any longer. And in short, what I surmise from this, and as you'll recall from just what I just showed you on his report, that was not the only amino acid that he had. In fact, he also had a glutamine deficiency in here as well. But the reason that this is all important is that those things, the carnitine, the glutamine, those all point to him being in a continual state of breakdown. So this individual was a previous endurance runner, running marathons, long distance training, and essentially had pushed himself into a catabolic or breakdown type of pattern. And so in looking at where I ended up trying to steer him, one of my primary recommendations for him was, we need to take a look at getting more carnitine in through your diet. And let's use that as our foundation and as our starting point. And we know that we can do that from increasing the carnitine by virtue of increasing red meat consumption. We can increase poultry consumption. But red meat, by and large, is going to have the greatest carnitine concentrations in it. Now, one thing that I do think is important as it relates to the testing that I showed you, the particular information that I looked at with him, that particular test is looking at intracellular levels of nutrients. Now, why am I making a point about this? Well, the reason I'm making a point about this has to do with the fact that when you look at how much of the carnitine is actually found in the plasma, in the serum, we typically are looking at about 0.5%. So translated the other direction, that means that 99.5% of our carnitine is going to be found inside of the cell, and for good reason. Predominantly because that carnitine is being used to shuttle fatty acids into the energy production sites of the cell, what we typically will refer to as the mitochondria. And we need that carnitine to be able to pull the fatty acids, which it's helping burn for energy, to pull those fatty acids out of the blood, pull it into the inside of the cell, and then also to get it across the two membranes to where it can ultimately be burned for energy. So carnitine is going to be essential for that. And all of your what are known as your long chain fatty acids, many of the ones that you find in your diet, require carnitine to ultimately use those as an energy source. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to point out in relation to that, and they're related to some of the dietary patterns out there. So This utilization of carnitine is not solely about just using or just burning fat. Keep in mind that there's more to this than an aesthetic appearance. We want to efficiently be able to burn fat as an energy substrate. And one of the things that I've noticed over time in looking at reports for my patients, looking at reports for other doctors' patients, is individuals that follow a keto diet, and I'll make some caveats here, but individuals that follow a keto diet tend to be at greater risk for carnitine deficiencies. Now, the caveat on this is really based on the amount of protein and maybe the types of proteins that one consumes in the diet. If that keto diet is pointed more towards fat consumption versus protein consumption, then that individual is probably going to be at greater risk for a carnitine deficiency. But again, this is all based on what the total dietary pattern is, how much meat that individual is consuming. So there are a lot of factors to consider here, but if you are keto, it is at least worth the consideration on this. I do find it interesting from a dietary standpoint when we look at something like grass-fed, grass-finished beef that has an ideal fatty acid ratio. We're getting those fatty acids in, and especially if it is a more heavily marbled piece of meat. We like to try to finish our animals where they do have more marbling on them, because we think that I personally think that there is an exceptional amount of value in the fatty acids that are found in those meat, even beyond just the omega-3s. Speaking also to things like conjugated linoleic acid and even some of the saturated fats that we find in there. Point being on that is that in that particular food source, you have both a combination of these long chain fats and carnitine. And so it's just really an opportunity for the availability of that carnitine in that food source to help us shuttle those fats into the cell to be burned for energy, versus having to try to consume those from different food sources. It's all in one. So there are some considerations around that. Also, if you look at the production of carnitine and really how we find it, I want to point to a few things here to share another diagram with you. If you look to the production of carnitine can come from the diet, as we've been talking about, but we can also synthesize or produce carnitine within the body. We do that through converting the amino acids lysine or methionine to be able to do that. Consuming through the diet is more efficient, and the amount of carnitine is going to be balanced or maintained through the kidneys. So when we have too much carnitine, we'll excrete out that excess carnitine. When we have too little, we'll reabsorb back in the carnitine. But there is a third way to get this, which is through supplementation. Now, again, from comments that I've made a bit earlier, you can see why I would be a bit more of an advocate for consuming these through the diet, predominantly because you're going to have a food source there that is going to have everything included with it. And there's actually some other reasons I'm getting ready to talk about as far as these secondary metabolites, these other beneficial compounds that we find in red meat that would make it advantageous. Inherently, just because the total consumption of carnitine is not as rich in a vegan or vegetarian diet, those individuals may be more prone to deficiencies in these particular nutrients, so that is of consideration. But I also want to just go back and point to the initial report that I shared with you there for that individual. That individual was not a vegan or a vegetarian. He still ended up with a carnitine deficiency. So there's nothing that says that a vegan or vegetarian is definitively going to have a carnitine deficiency, and vice versa. It doesn't mean that if you do consume red meat or other meats as well, that you're completely devoid of running the risk of creating a carnitine deficiency. That's just not the case. Now, I will tell you, when it comes to the utilization of carnitine in the diet, you will get a greater utilization of carnitine from your dietary sources. The literature on this suggests that you're going to be somewhere in the range of about 57 to 84% as far as what you can take in from the diet. Whereas when you're using that carnitine from supplementation, you're in the teens on that. Does it mean that the carnitine supplementation is bad? No, I think there is a time and a place for that. However, it doesn't mean that we do it at the expense of avoiding the carnitine sources in our diet. And I think for a lot of individuals, once they've gotten their carnitine deficiencies replaced, either through supplementation and or diet, that they can fairly easily maintain that through having a dietary pattern that does continue to include red meat, whether that's coming from beef, whether that's coming from bison, lamb, goat, venison, whatever the source on that is. Now, there is another portion to this whole story, and this goes into a bit of the villainization that we sometimes hear as it relates to red meat. A lot of times fingers are pointed at red meat. I think a lot of this ends up being propaganda, and the full spectrum of the conversation around these talking points is not brought out. And so what I want to do in this conversation with you today is I want to try to share with you what one of the concerns is, but I also want to share some additional perspectives that are based in the medical literature and highlight some questions that we've developed in terms of, is red meat really a risk factor for cardiovascular disease? So this all comes back to a conversation around something called TMAO. And TMAO, let me show you here. TMAO is a compound that is derived from carnitine can be a source of it, choline can be a source of it, your phosphatidylcholine. All of these are considered to be sources of your TMAO. You can even see that when we start to look at the fish species are going to increase TMAO levels as well. And the concern around that is potentially that there's going to be some risk associated with damage in the kidney. You're also going to see some cardiometabolic complications linked to this as well. Things like atherosclerosis, type 2 diabetes, stroke risk. And so point being here is that when you start to talk about the consumption of red meat, the prevailing theory on this has been that is going to drive up your TMAO, and as your TMA goes up, your cardiovascular risk increases as well. Now, I'm going to share with you some problems with this thought process, and one of which is the fact that much of this information much of the thought process derived around this information originated out of animal studies. And as we know, animals and humans do not equate to each other. Animals can be a good lead-in to help us further investigate some possible concerns and try to draw conclusions in humans. But at the end of the day, to really draw those conclusions, we have to do research to be able to validate that. So this same thing is true as we begin to talk about TMAO here. So what are some concerns that pop up around this, apart from just the difference between animal studies and human studies? Well, to me, there's two other factors that play into this conversation, and I want to share with you one study that I felt like did an excellent job of drawing this out. What are some of the problems around this? And so let me point to one of these right away here. And so this is a study that directly calls out the trimethylamine N oxide, which is going to be your TMAO. But you'll notice right here in the abstract, they talk about fish and seafood contain considerable amounts of TMAO, and I'll actually show you how much of those they contain here in just a moment. But they contain considerable amounts of TMAO and are generally accepted as cardioprotective. And so a puzzling paradox that seems to be neglected, and even refer to this as being a red herring. So it's a bit difficult just right at face value here when we start to talk about red meat and poultry, and we say that TMAO that is derived from these sources is going to be creating cardiovascular disease, but yet in the same hand we look at this and we say that fish species are going to in turn not create a problem with their TMAO, even though it's the same chemical, same molecular structure, and we're going to say that those don't cause an issue and may even in the opposite be protective. And so that seems to be a bit of a contraindication there, or contradiction, better stated, not contraindication, contradiction there. And so there's a couple of other things that I thought in this study that were worth pointing out too that really seem to make this even more significant. And so if we come down and we start to look, again, your fish species, as it states down here, are going to have significant quantities of free TMAO. And then if you actually start comparing these, you'll see that your cod is an example that was used here, and they're just using this as a representative fish species because it's very easy to find in the marketplace. You'll notice on this one 45 to 50 millimoles per kilogram. And what I want you to take away from this is look at the drop as we go forward in these numbers. So eggs, which are high in choline, you'll see here down to 24 millimoles per kilogram. And then the red meat drops all the way down to amounts to less than 10 millimoles per kilogram. And so we can see that fish has a higher amount than eggs or red meat. And so why are we villainizing the red meat? That doesn't make sense, but yet on the same hand, we're raising up the fish on a pedestal saying it's cardioprotective. So there's a problem with that, right? Now, there's one other piece of this that I do want to point out to you as well. And that comes down to another statement that was drawn out in this paper, but I'm going to show you a diagram first here. And you'll notice on this that individuals who have an unhealthy lifestyle, we know that they are more prone to cardiovascular disease, cardiometabolic disease. There's a lot of reasons for that, but one that has certainly got more attention in the last decade or more now has been the impact that the gut plays on that. And when the gut is in this state of dysbiosis, that dysbiosis for a number of different mechanisms has a tendency to drive that cardiometabolic disease. Now, this is something that we absolutely should be paying attention to. We should be looking at the cardiometabolic risk in relation to dysbiosis, but as it relates to our conversation here around TMAO, this dysbiosis plays a whole other factor into this conversation. So here's how this plays out, and look at, again, same paper here, and researchers bringing out another point on this. But we scroll down here, and they start to talk about this ratio of Firmicutes to Bacteroidetes in the gut was notably higher in individuals producing high TMAO levels than in low TMAO producers. So let me state this a little bit more clearly, which is to say that if you have a higher predominance of Firmicutes to Bacteroidetes, you are going to produce a higher amount of TMAO. However, if your Bacteroidetes is higher than your Firmicutes and you have an ideal ratio, so you should see more Bacteroidetes compared to Firmicutes, there is a higher probability that your TMAO levels are going to be lower. So that is certainly of concern. Now, what else comes into this conversation? Well, remember earlier when I said that we were going to be talking about these secondary metabolites in red meat? Well, make note here, phenolic activity, or phenolic antioxidant resveratrol. So that phenolic activity referred to, and in this case, you'll typically find resveratrol in red wine. But note here, these phenolic compounds inhibit TMA production by reduced TMA production after remodeling the gut microbiota. So that resveratrol is going to change the profile of the gut microbiota such that there is a reduction in TMA, the precursor to TMAO, and there's a reduction in TMAO. Now, the reason that this is important in the context of red meat, in the context of pasture-raised, grass-fed, and finished meat, is that we are now starting to see that these compounds can actually be found in these animals that are raised in a regenerative model. So the animals that we're raising out here at Harvest Hills Ranch, they are grass finished. They're working on their natural forage the entirety of their life cycle. And so what that means is that there is a greater accumulation of these phenolic compounds as well as others, but there's a greater accumulation of these phenolic compounds in the final meat product of that animal. So in this whole bigger conversation where we're starting to look at, is consumption of red meat, because of its production of TMAO, a real concern? I think you have to look at this with a high level of scrutiny and say, this doesn't really add up. And so when you're worried about the consumption of red meat as it relates to cardiovascular disease, my suggestion to you would be is that there's not a concern there based on this particular pathway, and there is an attribute to red meat offering some cardioprotective effects in and of itself. We'll talk more about that down the road, but I wanted to clear up this conversation around L-carnitine and highlight for you some of the benefits that L-carnitine does offer, but also get rid of some of the concerns that if I do consume that red meat because of the choline, because of the carnitine, because of these compounds in there, I've just skyrocketed my cardiovascular risk. Not the case. You're going to have a lot of other benefits associated with that carnitine and even with the choline by consumption of red meat. So make that a consistent part of your diet. You will benefit from that for the reasons we've talked about today, as well as numerous others that we'll get into down the road. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up here, guys. Hey, if you want to learn more about what we're doing, you can check us out at harvesthillsranch.com. Love to have you stop by and just even take a peek at what a regenerative farm looks like. And if you're anywhere near in Southeast Texas, or if you just want to come out sometime and take a tour of the farm, hey, look at our events page and see when we're having our free farm tour days. We'd love to have you come join us. And if you want to know more about the work that I'm doing on my clinic side, you can check out drarlandhill.com and see what I do there and learn about the process that I use to support my patients and basing my patients in the right foods to help build a foundation for their diet. So with that being said, guys, I'm going to close this out here. I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Until next time, Dr. Arland Hill. Have a good one.